Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Romina Ichon. On February 28, 2019, PRI held its first annual policy conference in Sacramento. This is the second in a series of podcasts featuring the 4 panels at the conference. This podcast is on education, specifically charter schools and their role in meeting the diverse needs of California students. The conference was emceed by PRI board member Dan Koki. You'll hear his voice in the beginning, and the panelists were PRI Senior Director of Education, Lance Izumi, Fortune School CEO Margaret Fortune, and EdVoice's Bill Lucia. They share real-life charter school success stories and explore ideas policymakers can embrace to expand school choice options. Thanks for joining us.
As you know, the charter schools are the favorite punching bag for the teachers' union. The governor, you may recall, has recently said, in fact, is in the State of the State address, that he was going to set up a panel to look into the impact of charter schools on public school finances. And yet it's really the public school finances where you find fiscal mismanagement. The charter schools provide competition and choice, which always improves the efficiency of a market, provides choices and empowers the individual. So our panel today is going to talk about the need for education reform, market solutions like choice for educational reform, and particularly charter schools. And moderating the panel, we have PRI's Senior Director of PRI Center for Education, Lance Izumi. Now, Lance has written widely on education reform, charter schools. For 11 years, Lance served on the Board of Governors of California's community colleges. And of the 11 years, 2 terms as chair of the Board of Governors of California's community colleges. Lance also served as chair of the foundation for the California Community Colleges, which is a nonprofit that supports the community colleges. So Lance has both scholarly as well as hands-on experience with respect to the issues of education reform. So with that, I'd like to have you welcome Lance Izumi, who will then introduce the panel. Lance?
Thank you very much. Thanks. Well, thank you very much, Dan, for that very generous introduction. Yes, I did serve on the Board of Governors and did all those other things. Just wanted to mention, though, that, and hearkening back to what Dan Walter said in our introductory keynote address this morning, when he was talking about kind of the politics of California, that in my previous life, before I joined the think tank business, I served as a political speechwriter for the early part of my career. I was a speechwriter for County Supervisor Mike Antonovich down in Los Angeles County. I know some of you know Mike Antonovich, a long time, great supervisor down there. He was part of that hook that Dan Walters was talking about in LA County. And I also served as speechwriter for U.S. Attorney General Ed Meese in the Reagan administration, and then finally ended up as chief speechwriter for Governor George Duke Machen. So I always tell folks that if you ever wanted to know, who gave the Duke all that charisma, it was me. And also, too, behind every great man, there's a little Japanese guy at a keyboard. So, but with that, I'm here to, we're going to talk about charter schools today. And I think that, one of the great ways to start off talking about charter schools is to do a little storytelling. I was chatting with some folks this morning and saying that one of the problems I think that our side doesn't do is that we don't tell stories. We all, and being in the think tank industry, I've done my share of writing great studies, I think, great books that rely on a lot of data crunching. And we think if we just crunch more of those numbers, that we're going to convince our fellow citizens to support our point of view, right? Well, that should be the case, and PRI does a great job with doing that. Just look at this last panel on healthcare. But I also think that, what we need to also do is do more storytelling, and to be able to tell people about what is happening in the education system, but in a very human sort of way. Charter schools are an important part of the education system here in California. They're independent, autonomous, publicly funded schools that have a lot more freedom and flexibility to improve student performance and provide educational and learning services to these kids. But, it's a lot more than test scores. It's a lot more than all those numbers that you'll see the newspapers publish once a year when, the standardized tests come out. So what I want to do to start off is to show our most recent film on a great charter school and, do a little storytelling for you. This film that you're going to see is on Life Learning Academy, which is a charter school, which is one of the charter schools that I profile in my new book, Choosing Diversity, which all of you have a copy of if you picked up one of your complimentary gift bags at the back. And so I'll talk about this book in just a few minutes after the film. But Life Learning Academy is chapter 1 in my book because it counters the claim made by the opponents of charter schools that charter schools only do well because they cream the crop of the best students in every district. So, when charter schools say, hey, we should have more charter schools, well, it's only because, you're basically poaching the best students. Well, what we're going to show in this film, and I'm not going to spoil it for you, but, these are kids who are going to this charter school, which is on Treasure Island in San Francisco, and these are the most challenged, very diverse, but also, in the words of Terry Delaney, who is the executive director at Life Learning Academy, the biggest pains in the school system. How can the folks who oppose charter schools look those kids in the eye and say, well, we don't want you to have that chance, or we don't want people who are in your similar situation to have those chances? And so that's the reason why we did this film. It's also the reason why, as I said, in your book, in your packets, we have my new book called Choosing Diversity. And what the book is all about is to look at the broad diversity of charter schools, not only here in California, but also across the country. I profile 13 different charter schools. Life Learning Academy is chapter 1. So if you really want to know a lot more about this school, at least read the first chapter. But you'll find incredible schools that you never thought, might come under the charter school umbrella. You often hear, for example, that charter schools don't accept kids with special needs, kids who have disabilities, for example. And yet one of the best charter schools in the country is called New York City Autism Charter School, which only accepts kids who are on the autism spectrum. And these are not kids who are just mildly autistic. These are some of the most autistic children in New York City, and they have not been able to find a place within the regular public school system. And yet, two moms who tried to find a good place in the regular schools for their kids found that they couldn't get a great education for their kids with autism. They decided to use their charter school program law in New York to start their own school, and now it is one of the best schools for special needs kids in the country, and it's a charter school. There are all kinds of other charter schools that you'll find in the book. Schools, for example, here in the Sacramento area, Natomas Charter School, which has a fantastic performing arts academy there. If you ever want to see an incredible professional quality production of a musical, for example, like Oklahoma or Hairspray, go to a performance at Natomas Charter School. It'll blow you away. The schools that, and for those of you, who may wonder, well, where's the future of education? We hear about millennials who are coming out of our school system without seemingly, values and any kind of grounding. Certainly in the history of our country. Well, here in Sacramento, there's John Adams Academy, which I profile in the book, and we had our initial launch event for the book at John Adams Academy in Roseville, and that school focuses on our founding documents, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, on a classical education model. I saw the most incredible Socratic discussion in one of the classes between a history teacher and a student as they were discussing the Greek god Apollo. and the teacher said that, well, this is what Apollo stands for, and the student in the class said, well, actually, that's not quite true, and went into this mini dissertation on what Apollo really stood for. And the teacher at the end said, you're right. That is a much better explanation about the god Apollo than what I provided to all of you. That's the kind of deep thinking that, that type of model is giving their kids. And, I must say, just as one last anecdote, when I first went to John Adams Academy, I was, just struck by, I got there, in time for the first bell. And when the first bell went off, I didn't just go inside the school and, go into a classroom to watch what was going on. Instead, the kids came out to me in the sense that they came pouring out of the school building, gathered around the flagpole and the American flag, and they all in unison sang a patriotic song. Every morning, that school does that. What school does that anymore? I mean, you hear schools, for example, that are trying to rip George Washington's name off of the names of their schools. After the founding fathers ripped those names off their schools, and yet here in a charter school, instead, the kids are coming out and they're singing "Home on the Range" in front of the American flag. I hadn't heard "Home on the Range" since I was probably like 7 years old, but it was great. And so there's a lot of storytelling that goes on in this book, and I think you'll find it really interesting. It's, I think in that sense, probably my most accessible book that I've written. So for some of you who have had the stamina, who have read some of my other books, thank you. But I think you're going to really enjoy this book because, what you saw in the film, you'll see a lot of that in this book, and so I hope you enjoy it. But with that, as much as charter schools have done well, there are also huge challenges facing charter schools. And in this state, as you know, over the last few weeks, we've seen these challenges pop up. In the Los Angeles teachers' strike, for example, you saw that it wasn't just about wages or benefits and those sorts of things. It was also about charter schools. And the supposed pro-charter school majority on the LA School Board eventually voted for a resolution calling on the state for a moratorium on the expansion of charter schools. Now, many of the charter schools that I profile in this book are expanding. Like John Adams Academy that I mentioned, they started in Roseville. They've added a new campus in El Dorado Hills, a new campus in Lincoln, Life Learning Academy, which is on Treasure Island. They want to be a model for these types of children, not only around the state, but around the country. And yet, there are these calls for a cap or moratorium on charter schools in this state. And who's that going to affect? It's going to affect those kids like Carlos and Micah, who you saw in that film. And so to help us discuss kind of the landscape for charter schools as we go forward over the next few years, we have two of the best people I could ever have hoped to have as panelists. They're my friends, but they're also just two of the smartest people in education that you'll ever want to meet. And, the first is Margaret Fortune, who I've known for many, many years. Margaret is the president and CEO of Fortune Schools, which is a network of charter schools. Under her leadership, the organization launched a network of K-12 public charters in Sacramento and San Bernardino with the mission of closing the African American achievement gap. She's also served as an education advisor to 2 California governors. And, as Dan had mentioned about me, that I was on the board of governors for the California community colleges, Margaret served as a trustee on the California State University system. So, our graduates hopefully were able to go to your system. And so, even more than that, though, I want to thank Margaret for her just general leadership in the charter school movement for many years. We have gotten to this place here in California because of the great efforts of people like Margaret Fortune, and so I want to welcome Margaret and say that we all owe you a great debt. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, Lance. I'm so glad to be here today. And I want to thank my hosts for inviting me. I enter this work as an educator, having come from a family of educators. My father is a school superintendent locally here in Sacramento. He's retired now, but he handed me my high school diploma. So I grew up driving to school with Dad. His father before him was a principal, and my father attended his schools in the rural South. My grandfather was the principal, and my grandmother was the union president for the teachers. So those must have made for some interesting background coming from a one-room rural schoolhouse, the kind of place where for lunch they churn their own butter, the kind of place where you have multiple grades in one classroom. And so that was the work of my parents' parents, and they were considered to be a good match because they both came from families of educators. And I give that background because my work, as Lance has intimated, has taken me into policy work, advising 2 California governors on both sides of the aisle, Gray Davis and most recently Arnold Schwarzenegger, on education policy. But I found that the best place to employ my talents to solve the problem that is nearest and dearest to my heart and has been generationally in terms of the education of African American students was in the charter school space. Because charter schools are as diverse as the educators who dream of them and implement them. My school and my work is about closing achievement gaps, and so we are authorized by the County Board of Education in Sacramento County to do a regional initiative for a regional problem. African American students are the lowest performing subgroup other than students with special needs. And the County Board of Education made a finding of fact that in every school district in Sacramento County, all 13 of them, there was no place an African American family could go and not confront this achievement gap. And so there was a demand from the community to fix this. After spending years and years and years and generations butting one's head up against the wall, going to school board meetings in the place where you're supposed to advocate for positive change and not seeing it happen. And so the community came together through my organization, Fortune School, and advocated for a group of schools to help get at this problem. And we are open to all students, but we specifically exist to close the African American achievement gap. And because we are so relentlessly focused on this work, where we have a team of people who is trying to crack this nut, trying to figure it out, lo and behold, we are figuring it out. And we do what we do successfully because we study the work of other people. We write books about it. Our latest book is called Bridging the Gap, and it's about the high-performing majority African American schools in the state that are performing above the state average in English language arts and math, even though they're majority of African American, majority low income, and we study all the schools who know how to do this work. Now, there are 12 schools in the state that have been successful in not just bridging a gap, but closing the achievement gap and going beyond. 8 of them are public charter schools. We go across the country and spend a lot of time in New York with schools that are successful with our demographic to understand what it is they're doing. Now, if we were in the context of a traditional public school where African American students make up about 6% of the population, the entire school system would not be focused on figuring out how to solve this problem. Because they're a minority of students. They're a minority among minorities. But because our school, within the diverse landscape of charter schools, is relentlessly focused on solving this problem, I'm here to report that in the last year's assessment on the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, which is the state examination in mathematics, we had the highest growth in student performance in the county. Typically, you see about a 1% bump in student achievement on math state examinations. Ours was 10%. Our authorizer told us in a public setting that the African American students, there is no difference between their performance and the typical performance of public school students. And so we have closed that gap for the African American students that attend our schools in mathematics. We are not operating in an environment like the one that has been created in the state, where we can back away from the performance of our students by failing to measure that performance in a rigorous way. We look at their performance every single week. We have a dashboard. We look at their attendance. We look at the enrollment. We look at the extent to which kids are persisting in schools, meaning not dropping out or transferring. We look at their weekly assessments. We look at their NWEA assessments, which are taken 3 times a year to compare their performance to kids like them across the country. We look at their suspension rates. We look at all of these statistics because we're passionate about demonstrating that our kids can and will perform if they're given a rigorous education, but also because the consequence of failure within a charter school setting is that your school gets shut down. There's a lot of rhetoric right now that there's a lack of accountability for charter schools. That is a false narrative. Every 5 years, we come up for a very thorough examination against every promise we made to the school board that approved us in the first place. Very thorough examination. And if we are found wanting, our schools will be closed. That's based on the academics, and that's based on the finances. The consequence of charter schools not performing or not managing their books is to be shut down. It's not to be bailed out by the state and taken over. That's a very different playing field than our traditional public schools. Now, I will say to you that charter schools are public schools, and we are a part of the public school landscape. I'm the daughter, as I shared with you earlier, of a school superintendent. So my investment in the public school system is very high. And I think that charter schools are a part of a landscape in public education. There are 660,000 students enrolled in charter schools, over 1,300 schools. We represent 10% of student enrollment. The people making the choices to enroll their kids in charter schools are the parents and guardians themselves. Most of this expansion is happening in the inner cities. Parents vote with their feet. I'm very sensitive to that because they cast those votes on charter schools every day. They understand that there is a customer service relationship here. If you take that away, it makes all educators, whether you're working in the public charter school space or the traditional public school space, less sensitive to the parents who are our customers and to the needs of the children. I find it disturbing that an education group would spend so much time villainizing and denigrating the work of other public school educators. It's outrageous. And people like the executive director that you saw featured in the video that Lance offered are educators passionately working hard every single day, just like their counterparts in the traditional public schools. I trust and believe, more so now than I've been spending. I'm an educator, so I have to be on time. Lance gave me 10 minutes. And the bell rang. I trust and believe that public school educators, regardless of what their setting is, and all educators are working incredibly hard on behalf of students. And that video telling the story of the perspective of that executive director whose dream that school is and that school has been working at it for 20 years replicates the passion that we see operating in public charter schools and traditional schools across the state of California. The last thing I'll say is this. One perspective of mine that has changed since I was Governor Schwarzenegger's senior advisor on education is with regards to public school funding. I think it is very short-sighted for us to continue down this path of education wars. Education needs to be united because that California educators have $11,000 per student, and New York educators have $22,000 per student. There doesn't make sense to me. There actually is more you can do with greater resources. But to make that case in a compelling way to the public, all educators have to be on the same page, be willing to hold themselves accountable for student performance to make that case to the taxpayers that we warrant an additional investment, which I believe we do. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Margaret. As you can see, I wish we could bottle up Margaret's passion, And our next panelist, is my great friend Bill Lucia. People ask me, what do I want to do when I grow up? Well, I want to become Bill Lucia. Bill Lucia is the president and CEO of EdVoice, and EdVoice is the nonprofit that advocates for policies that increase student achievement, as Margaret was talking about, increase student achievement and eliminate inequality and improve educational quality and opportunity throughout California. Bill previously served as the executive director of the State Board of Education. And, if you ever want to hear some great war stories, listen to Bill's stories about when he was the executive director of the State Board of Education. You can spend not just a night, but an entire week of nights listening to that. He's also held, various key positions, staff roles, both in the California legislature and in Washington, D.C. He's also served in senior roles with the Legislative Analyst's Office and with the Department of Finance. It's often mentioned that, if you ever looked at California's education code, right, and you stacked them end to end, they'd probably reach the top of this ceiling, right? But if you ever wanted to stack up Bill Lucia's knowledge about education, it'd go from here to the moon. And so, with that, I want to introduce my great friend, Bill Lucia.
It's all going to be worse now, after that. I do have to, you reminded me that when I looked over at Dan, I was the first executive director of the State Board of Education under Governor Wilson, and we had a lot of legal challenges in even getting staffed up. The first day on the job, I was given a volunteer slip by the state superintendent of public instruction left on my chair, and said that I needed to be underneath her responsibility, even because the legal paperwork hadn't arrived yet, in a need to create a new position with new staff that were in fact gubernatorial appointees and serving the governor's appointed State Board of Education. And the ultimate resolution of, I refused to sign it. I went down to the Human Resources Department and just told them, so I wasn't going to fake it or anything. I'm not going to sign this thing. And if I slip and fall, then it's on me. That was how the thing was. It was a liability issue, is how they tried to couch it, but they were trying to put me in a position of aligning away from an appellate court decision that had actually, where Governor Wilson and his board had prevailed in suing the state superintendent, saying that the State Board of Education is the policymaking body of education in California, and that the Department of Education, as state superintendent of public instruction, is to execute those policies. So the board was the brain, and the department was the arms and legs in getting things done. Ultimately, it took a a negotiation over an uncodified bill. We can talk about that. Anybody wants to talk about what an uncodified bill is, and handing two pieces of paper at the fountain between the courts building and the library building to get things signed, and then ultimately getting my first paycheck after that. So anyway, this is a kind of a odd time to be right here this morning talking to you about charter schools and landscape of education reform, because just in the assembly less than an hour ago, they voted on another layer of regulation on charter schools, which is in some ways unfortunate. In other ways, it's just get it done, pound of flesh. Elections have consequences, and now move on. There's a lot of misinformation about charter schools, and under the auspices of transparency, the label of transparency and needing to have charters to be more transparent. Margaret touched on this a little bit. There are a lot of other things that get shoehorned into that, and they're really, without going into the details of it, there are ways in which the establishment, and I would say the establishment, and I'll dig into that a little bit, the establishment is a lot of different groups of adults that have a vested interest in keeping the status quo. And the best way that they can preserve the status quo is to stifle innovation and competition, and just think about it in the marketplace, right? If you have competitors, you're going to focus on cost minimization. If you're not a government monopoly, you're going to focus on cost minimization, try and tailor your products to be consumer oriented. The consumer's number one, and you're going to deal with the issues of the regulatory environment in ways that are going to be the best for your company as you compete with other companies. In the public good of education, it's different than that, and it's different necessarily. Nonetheless, we're at a moment in time where the question of the Los Angeles teacher strike, the Oakland teacher strike, there's not a teacher strike in Sac City, and I'll tell you why. My thought is about why that is in part, but where the issue of the delivery of services, the cost for the delivery of services, the modality, the governance structure is being put into question. And a big change in the landscape where we are in 2019 versus where we were in the 1990s, for example, is there's a lack of public discourse about, in my view, about the condition of public education in California. So if I know many of you in the room, I can tell because I actually have more gray hair than might look, remember the Nation at Risk report and people being really concerned about public education in this nation, and people in California being concerned. Thought leaders, community leaders, school superintendents, management in schools, teachers in schools were all concerned about outcomes in public education and not being what they should be or could be, and wanting to do something about that. We are now in an environment where we don't have the kind of transparency about outcomes or an understanding really of what's going on in the demography of schools and school enrollment in California. I don't know how many folks know that you're having other panels and you're getting a flavor of this already, but California today in 2019 is a poverty factory, and the government services are insufficient to address the pathologies of poverty. And there's a lot of people that just want government to be the solution to absolutely everything and have a command and control top-down system. And that's not working in education. Charter schools were part of a solution as a portfolio solution back in the 90s to say, okay, one other thing is, I know everybody in this room was at least born, but 1993 vouchers were on the California ballot. Again, at the end of that decade, vouchers were on the ballot. There are people that are coming of age politically that have voted in this last election last November that were either in diapers or were zygotes or didn't exist in 1993. And so, and haven't had a conversation about, is the landscape okay? Is it okay? Do you all know that 60% of public school enrollment are kids in poverty in California today? 60% of public school enrollment. Kids in poverty today are last in math. Margaret talked about mathematics achievement and awesome results, right? I actually am a data geek. You heard I worked at the Department of Finance. I noted in my brain, 8 schools. 8 schools are awesome. Did you also hear what she said? She said there are 1,300 charter schools, and there are actually over 8,000 traditional public schools. And 8 schools are awesome. Does anybody know in this room that 14% of African American kids are proficient in math? 14%. That's not okay. Do you know that California is last, absolutely last in math for poor kids? Last in the nation. So if you are African American and you wanted to get a better public school education, you'd be better to go from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., you're better off being a poor African American kid to learn math than California. In the 90s, when there was an appreciation for how serious this is in terms of the future of California, it was not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It was a California issue. We need to do something about it. Gray Davis called a special session and had 4 bills that he rammed through, even over a lot of objection by Democrats in the legislature, to say we need to do something about that. And today, though, we have an oddity of a lot of people really in a monopoly hunkering down collusion effort to preserve the status quo. The charter schools, Margaret's being kind of kind here, but they are a very important agitating role. They represent 10% of the overall population, but why you have hotspots like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Sacramento are in the threat of strike or in financial challenges in blaming the scapegoat as charters, is you get to a point where they may be 10% statewide, but in districts like Oakland and Los Angeles, they're getting a critical mass of about 20%. And when you get 20% of enrollment and you think about competition of a monopoly, if you're no longer a monopoly, but you actually have serious competition, you have to start thinking about legacy costs. You have to think about restructuring. You have to think about reordering your thinking about how you're delivering services and how you're serving your customer. And in the case of Los Angeles and Oakland, they don't want to do anything substantially different. The status quo is okay. California is moving backward. So looking at the new state tests, the cohort of kids, the longer they stay in California, the bigger proportion of that cohort of kids is not meeting grade level expectations. California last spring, for the first time in its history, went backward in 11th grade math. It wasn't just the 1%. You would have expected, psychometricians on tests would say, you would expect at least a 1% natural growth in tests just because of familiarity with an assessment program. 11th grade kids in California went backward in math, okay? You all hopefully will appreciate that you can't put a bushel over the light of success, and we actually need more of it, not less of it. And we need to ask some serious questions. I know you ended on money. I'm going to end on money. I'm going to end a different way on money, because when you add it all up, all the money, not just the local property tax, the state money, the federal money that comes in, don't believe me, believe the Department of Finance. Governor Newsom's Department of Finance says it's over $17,000 a child. $17,000 a child. So they had a march in the streets of Los Angeles, and they talked about, lowering class size, figuring out how to pay teachers, Did anybody ask the question of what, and they say there's 39 kids per teacher in LA. That's what they got it reduced by 1 student, was part of the negotiated agreement, plus a 6% raise. But did anybody do the back of the envelope math and ask a question? Okay, 39 kids in the classroom, $17,000 per kid. Okay, that's over $650,000 per classroom. Where'd the money go? Who's asking the questions? Is money being spent wisely? Where's it going? And it's a flat out lie, and I can spend more time in the hall or whatever. You can send in my emails. But it's a flat out lie that charter schools are pulling money away from regular school districts. School districts get paid more. The facts are school district gets more money and they get facilities. Okay? So think of this. If you're going to even just shut down and charters work more efficiently than the regular school district. Okay? So if you had actually just do everything the union wants and the administrators and the bureaucracy want, and shut down and have a moratorium, and actually go further than that and just say, close down charter schools and send all the kids back to the regular school district. Based on the cost structure and how they run the programs, they'd be even further in the red. Because yeah, the money goes back, but their production function, the back of the envelope, how they handle the delivery of services, is bankrupting the district. And it's bankrupting Oakland. It's bankrupt Oakland. California's been in charge of Oakland since 2003 in one form or another as a receivership or a trustee. That's all through the administration of Jack O'Connell as superintendent of public instruction and Tom Torlakson. For 16 years, the state of California is in charge, and Oakland is still going underwater. And they want to blame charter schools. Okay, interestingly, in Sac City, the county superintendent of public instruction here in Sacramento County has sent back the Sac City Unified budget and said you have to redo it twice now already, and Sacramento is about to go underwater and be taken over by the state here on the doorsteps of the Capitol. And the amazing thing is you don't hear them blaming charter schools. You know why? Because everybody knows back in the envelope, you could shut down every charter school in Sacramento, the city of Sacramento, and it wouldn't do any good because Sacramento City's always been hostile to charter schools. They don't have very many to begin with. So now they're staring in the face the fact that they're responsible for the own mess they made. And they can't do anything about it. So this is what happens when you have failed monopolies and you have a lack of transparency and communication in a public discourse, and you have Pravda-like education writers that are just taking the establishment messaging and pushing it out through the regular media channels. If you were to Google, I did this morning, Google how many charter schools are in California, you get an article that's a lie. And it doesn't talk about how many there are, it talks about for-profit charter schools that today are outlawed in California. There's no such thing. And out of over 1,300 charter schools, there was no more than about a dozen that even ever existed in California. But you have, education supposedly credible writers and publications that are now at the top of Google's search engine when you want to find out about what's going on with charter schools. So that's a piece of the landscape. You all should know that we should have more of Margaret in her schools, not less. And 8 is not enough. We have 8,000 traditional schools. We should have 8,000 of her, not 8,000 what we have now, because it's not working. Thank you.
Special thanks to Dan Kolke, Lance Izumi, Margaret Fortune, and Bill Lucia. Also to Tim Anaya, who is behind the scenes. And if you're interested in doing a deep dive on charter schools, Lance Izumi's new book, Choosing Diversity, can be pre-ordered on Amazon.com. And do join us for our panel next week on energy, moderated by PRI Senior Director Wayne Weingarten. If you're working on your vacation plans, consider mixing policy and cruising. Join PRI and the Claremont Institute for our 40th anniversary cruise on the Mediterranean. The cruise starts in Barcelona and ends in Rome with a special tour of the Vatican. Special guests include Andrew Roberts, author of Churchill, Walking with Destiny, and Charles Kessler, editor of the Claremont Review of Books. For more details, visit ci-pri.com. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.